to welcome all of you for coming tonight to the Crain Mailing Center of Jewish Culture lecture at Hendrix College. I appreciate everyone showing up, and it's a gorgeous day and coming out tonight for our excellent speaker that we have here tonight. First, I know you didn't come here to hear me, so obviously, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, and then he can take over. So here goes. Gotta get the reading glasses. Sorry. I'm welcoming Dan Raviv. He is a national correspondent for CBS Radio. He is a former foreign correspondent for CBS News. He's worked for over 20 years as a foreign correspondent for CBS, and he is now a Washington-based national correspondent for his radio network, as well as a best-selling author. His book that he's written, Every Spy of Prince, The Complete History of Israel's Intelligence Community, was a national bestseller. His book, Comic Wars, is the full story of one of America's most contentious business battles, the Marvel Comics bankruptcy. And his new book, Spies Against Armageddon, Inside Israel's Secret Wars, was released in July of 2012. And we've got books over here later, and it's an excellent book. I read it, and I think you would enjoy it as well. So he's going to be signing books after the lecture tonight. And anyway, I welcome, there's much more, but I'm just going to, you guys can hear him speak instead of me. All right, I welcome you.
I'm going to use a mic that's on my tie, so I'm going to give this back to you.
Thank you.
Here we go.
This is for the question and answers later.
Yeah, so that's a reminder to you, think of questions. If I say things that kind of pique your curiosity or your interest, but I say this maybe even more so to the students, it's all about learning. You ask questions, you find out things, I find out what you're interested in. But that even can include the career questions. People do wonder often, young people who haven't yet chosen their career, how do you get into TV and radio? What does it take to be a journalist these days? In my own case, I'll give you the smallest preview just to let you know how lucky I've been that there's been a lot of variety and excitement. My career just at CBS, and almost all radio, I don't do much TV, has been Boston, New York, Tel Aviv, London, Miami, and Washington. Those bureaus of CBS, living in all those different cultures. Got married to an American woman. I met her in Israel. In London, we had both our kids, so they have British passports as well as US passports. I'm sorry to report they lost their cute little English accents after we moved to Miami. That happens. And now we've been in Washington for about 16 years. So now it means that in my work, I cover everything that the country's talking about. It can be anything. It can be Obamacare. It can be, of course, the terrorism in Boston last week, the votes that are upcoming on immigration reform, you name it. And so I have to be a very broad person in what I cover for my regular job at CBS. But when you work on a book, you have to find a passion. And I would say that the central topic that interested me enough to write books about, in each case spending more than 2 years of research and writing and rewriting, etc., was Israel. Now, okay, that fits in here with where I'm giving the talk in Hendrix, and of course we're talking about a fine center of learning that's all about Jewish concerns. But I have found this. I'm an American, and being in the US all these years, even after those foreign postings by CBS, Americans actually are concerned about Israel. You don't have to be Jewish to worry about Israel, be concerned about Israel, or wish Israel well. After all, when Israel gets a foreign aid bill approved, or military aid is okayed by a president or by members of Congress, no president's ever been Jewish. The vast majority of members of Congress are not Jewish. Now, of course, Americans care. All sorts of reasons. Some of it is even Christian reasons. A lot of people who believe in the Bible are also worried about the land of the Bible. Who lives there? How is life maintained there? What will the future be? Some people are in fact so evangelical in their beliefs that they even think about the future in that maybe Christ will return, and if he does that, it will be there in the Holy Land, and the land until then should be held by the Jewish nation. All right? Some people look at it in totally non biblical ways and just look at the political facts. That Israel, since its establishment in 1948, has been friendly with the U.S. Has been almost an island of Western culture in the Middle East, which is mainly Arab countries, and Israel is different. Just like that, we've actually gotten to the core of the problem for Israel. Because you probably know, no matter what your age, and we seem to be in this room everything from 16 to 61, maybe even a bit more, that Israel from the very beginning hasn't been accepted by its neighbors. And if Israel's close to the U.S. and the American people care about Israel, then we all care about this problem, and we are often drawn into it. Now, I'll just mention a dramatic example. Some of you are too young to remember this. Here it is in very broad outlines. There was a Middle East war in 1973. The Arabs call it the October War, so you know what month it was in, October. The Israelis call it the Yom Kippur War because it actually broke out on the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement. It's the 10th day of the Jewish year. Rosh Hashanah is the first day. The 10th day is Yom Kippur. Jews are almost universally in a synagogue and praying and atoning. Even those who don't often go to synagogue and to services tend to go on Yom Kippur. Now that's usually true in Israel too. And that's the key to the war, at least at the very beginning. The Arab countries took Israel by surprise on that holy day where even the Israeli soldiers were praying. All the reservists that Israel depends on, great reserve soldiers who can be mobilized quickly, they were praying. The borders weren't well defended. They took Israel by surprise. That's the story. How does this pull the U.S. in? A couple of things happened then. The first thing is that the Soviet Union, are you too young to remember that? But you know, the big communist power, now known pretty much as Russia. Soviet Union broke into parts, of course, after 1990. The Soviet Union took the side of those Arab countries that had attacked Israel, notably Egypt and Syria. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, and the Soviets kept sending more and more weapons and resupplying their Arab client states, Syria and Egypt. And President Nixon decided, I've got to answer that. If the Soviet Union thinks that they can win a Middle East war against our little pro-Western country that many Americans care about, Israel, we've got to resupply Israel. And so together with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Defense Secretary James Schlesinger, President Nixon said, send them everything. What do they need? Just ask the Israelis what they need. It became largely, here's the phrase, a proxy war between the superpowers. You don't want the United States and the Soviet Union going to war. That's going to be a nuclear war. That's going to be too dangerous. But the Soviets had their client states that they favored in the Middle East, and so we had ours, Israel. And so that war, which lasted about 3 weeks, was very frightening to the Israelis because they were taken by surprise. The Israelis, despite their excellent army, and everyone knew that Israel's a tiny country, but with excellent intelligence, I write books about espionage and intelligence, and an excellent army, well-trained, great air force, just amazing for a little country. But still, Israel was knocked back in that October War in 1973. The U.S. aid played a big part in the Israeli military advances that allowed them pretty much to hold their own, though they did lose some territory on the Egyptian side especially. It was scary for the Israelis. And you know what? When the ceasefire was arranged, at the United Nations in New York, by the way, which was a way of saying that the Arabs and the Soviets had had enough. Okay, yeah, we'll sign a ceasefire in place. It'll therefore lead to some negotiations. By the way, if you were an optimist at the time, and you'll probably learn in the course of this evening that I tend to be an optimist. Even in the Middle East, where there are no solutions, and who knows what will happen next, I still tend toward the optimistic. And even then, I was quite young. But I was hopeful then that after that war, maybe something good would happen, and it did. In short, within a few years, Egypt and Israel were negotiating peace, and by 1979, they signed a peace treaty. Let's get those years again. The Yom Kippur Surprise War, late 73. By 79, they signed a peace treaty. That's momentous. That's a big deal. Sometimes wars, as destructive and horrible as they are with people dying, lead to a new situation that, among other things, leads leaders to believe there's no point to to this bloodshed. So Egypt and Israel gave up war, signed a peace treaty in '79, and despite all the problems in the region, that is held. But another American angle, around the time the ceasefire was arranged, Arab countries that were exporting oil realized, here's an interesting situation to take advantage of. Why don't we protest America's support for Israel by embargoing oil, refusing to sell any, refusing to export it? Now, they were part of a cartel, which means a group of nations or a group of companies, and under US law, by the way, a cartel is generally illegal, that competitors get together and talk about the pricing and the deliveries and all that. But on the world scale, there is quite openly OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC has a headquarters in Vienna, Austria. OPEC for many years was dominated by the Arab countries that produce oil, but Mexico's in it too, Venezuela's in it too. These are powerful oil exporting countries as well. OPEC, Arab dominated at the time, declared the embargo. Unbelievable. In this country, we had people waiting in line to buy gasoline round and round the block, all over the country. Prices soared up. It was a huge thing, the Arab oil embargo, and that's the way Americans knew it. That's what was in the news, the Arab oil embargo. And it shouldn't surprise you that there were some Americans, including politicians, who said, we're being hit by an oil embargo, we're having trouble now getting gasoline because of our support for Israel. Maybe we should rethink this. Now, the net result of that discussion, by the way, was the United States actually decided kind of to be defiant about it. We're not giving in to that. No, we are supporting Israel. To heck with that. And Americans became angry at OPEC, and that's sort of the lasting legacy of that. What was OPEC really up to, by the way? Changing the price of a gallon of oil. If I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of this, October of '73, a barrel of oil in the world was about $6 a barrel. You may know now it's about 90. When things are bad, it goes up over 100. It reached 141 about 5 years ago when our economy was weak, and it was the last thing we needed was a high oil price, but we had it 5 years ago, over 140. But back then, oil was $6 a barrel. The Saudis from Saudi Arabia were the main producers of oil. They were pumping it out of the ground with British and American engineers helping them, etc. And their cost of production for a barrel of oil apparently was well under $1. So selling it for $6 still made the Saudi Arabians very, very wealthy. But by the end of this emergency, they had pushed the price, the world price of oil, up to $20 and $30 a barrel, and it sort of stuck there, and it didn't go down again. And it went up and up and up and up, and countries that export oil became more and more wealthy. And we had, as Americans, a lot of our wealth being transferred over there, and that has incredible effects too, which includes, of course, an environmental movement over here, questioning why we should be dependent at all on fossil fuels and on petroleum, especially from countries that don't like us. A lot of these phrases will be familiar to you, but they really came out of a Middle East emergency. And many people still think that the main reason we even care about the Middle East is energy and oil, because we are still dependent on oil. And those who point out that America increasingly is producing its own oil, is buying from Canada, is buying from Mexico. Again, we don't have them as enemy countries. It's a better situation. But especially making more of our own energy, and maybe increasingly we'll get more from wind and solar. Natural gas could be used more. There's a controversy in this country as to whether to go deep underground, pump in lots and lots and lots of high pressure water, that's called fracking, and from that actually get oil, sometimes called shale oil. I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not arguing one way or the other, but environmentalists are against it, and those who want to be independent of Arab and OPEC oil are in favor of it. We got lots of energy here, we shouldn't care about the oil coming from Arab countries. I just have to tell you that some of the countries that are our allies, in Europe especially, but also Japan, are still incredibly dependent on oil from the Middle East. And so we still do care. It's still considered very strategic. It's not why we went to war in Iraq, in my opinion, but it's part of the story that Iraq was an oil-producing Arab country too, and Saddam Hussein was our enemy. We didn't want oil in the hands of our enemies. Iran produces oil. Iran is one of our foes. if not an active enemy right now. So oil is a problem, and it colors politics all the time. Well, let me tell you this. Israel's really small. It's a very, very narrow country from the day that it was created in May of 1948. So it just turned 65. Oh, by the way, it's not the month of May yet. Israel celebrates these big things according to the Jewish calendar, which is moon-based, the Jewish lunar calendar. That's why the date of a holiday like Hanukkah or Rosh Hashanah or even Yom Kippur floats every year to different dates on our calendar. Well, the Israel Independence Day, though if you read about it in history, you know it was May 15th, the beginning of Israel. Well, for their calendar over there, they just celebrated this past week. Israel had its 65th Independence Day, and 65 is kind of interesting, right? Any of you would know 65. That's not middle age anymore. That's retirement age. That's established age. That's, that's the positive side. And Israelis realize that too, saying, we're here to stay. Our existence is not questioned anymore. But in the beginning of 1948, it was. Our existence is not questioned, but it's not fully accepted. That's an Israeli point of view. And I can't remind you enough that the United States is linked to it. By the United States deciding out of sentiment, interests, and strategy in the Middle East, the United States is linked with Israel and its dramas. And when the whole existence of Israel was questionable at times, the U.S. was committed to it. As I said, Nixon, the resupply of all the military equipment, ammunition, hardware, etc. in 1973. Well, what about now? Well, I'm happy to say Israel's existence is not questioned, or is it? Let's consider even the map. I mentioned that Israel is really narrow. It's on the Mediterranean Sea. A lot of people forget how small it is. It's the size of the state of New Jersey. It's really small. And there are about 22 Arab and Islamic countries that are around it, if not on the immediate borders, and going all the way to North Africa and countries like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Arab countries, where in general the political culture is, oh, we don't like Israel, it's a Jewish interloper in our region. And especially if in general you believe in Islam, but I'm going to say political Islam. I'm not here talking about exactly how you pray and whether you're militant. And of course, as Americans, we know it's totally unacceptable and horrible if you follow someone like Osama bin Laden and think your religion is to, to kill civilians, plant bombs at the Boston Marathon or stage 9/11. But it's a political Islam that just has to do with unity, that over that whole region, right, it should be the way their Prophet Muhammad wanted it to be, converting people, chasing out the crusaders, etc. All right, so to them, the Jewish state being set up there is interloping. Now to the Jews, and to friends of the Jewish people and friends of Israel, hello, pick up your Bible. Where did King David live? Where was there? Where was there a Jewish kingdom? Where did Jews live? Why do all these places in that area where Israel is now, and even in the West Bank, which is controversial, because it was captured by Israel in 1967 from Jordan. So an Arab country was there, but all these places in the West Bank, many places, have Jewish, biblical, Hebrew names. And it helps explain, of course, why Israel, in general, wants to hang on to those locations, which is very, very controversial. So anyone who questions whether Israel belongs there at all, or are they interlopers, again, the Israeli case is we were here 2,000 years ago. Yes, we were exiled. The beginning of the end for this whole Jewish kingdom is an exile that took place, as I recall, in about the year 560 of the Common Era, after Jesus, about the year 560, and Jews are exiled out of their promised land. So to them, to Jewish people, and by the way, I'm an American Jew, so to us, that's Jews returning to their land after World War II, after the Nazi Holocaust, after 6 million Jews are murdered in Europe, in part because they had no safe shelter. There was no Jewish country. Even the United States was not giving shelter to Jews who were fleeing Europe and wanted to come. In limited numbers, some Jews got to move to South America or even to China. Jews were just looking for a safe place to be. There was no Jewish country. That's the story of World War II. 6 million Jews killed. There was this sense of needing a homeland. There already had been a Zionist movement throughout the first half of the 20th century. And so there was a powerful movement. Jews were living in that area. And if you don't know, it was called Palestine, and it was run by the British. From the end of World War I until the British left in 1948, for 30 years, the British ran Palestine. That was approved by international bodies. The League of Nations later became the UN. So that was approved, and the British announced that they would leave in 48 after 30 years. And the deal was, as approved by the UN, that there'd be a Jewish state set up, and the Jews who had lived there and wanted their own country, in part because of what happened in the Nazi Holocaust, would have their country, and the Arabs who lived in Palestine would have their country. And slightly oversimplifying, but I just want to say this in sort of broad strokes, the Israelis were thrilled, the Jews were thrilled with the deal, and Arabs, their leaders at least, rejected the deal. And from the day Israel was born in May of 1948, the Arab armies invaded. The small Jewish army of this new country of Israel fought back, though outnumbered, and managed to, in fact, expand its territory. And so a bigger chunk of what was to be this Palestine, cut into two countries, became a new Jewish state of Israel, and nobody said there should be an Arab state of Palestine anymore. Jordan hung on to the West Bank of the Jordan River, and Egypt hung on to the Gaza Strip, part of what was supposed to be Palestine. So Egypt and Jordan held that land. In 1967, Israel captured. Israel captured what? It's worth reminding you of the history. Again, some of you are too young. Some of you who are a little older like me will say, oh yeah. So Israel, in the 6-day war of June 1967, it lasted 6 days. It was amazing. Believe me, the media all over the world, and people especially remember this weekly magazine that covered the news called Life magazine. And Life magazine had this cover that just showed the Israelis as amazing fighters, that in 6 days they managed to defeat Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, 3 neighboring Arab countries. Egypt had not quite invaded Israel, but started strangling Israel. Egypt had decided to kick out the UN observers who had been in the Sinai. That's where Mount Sinai is, right? Where the 10 Commandments were handed down to Moses, according to the Bible. Mount Sinai is in a real place, the Sinai Peninsula, pretty much a desert that separates Egypt, which don't forget is the upper right corner of Africa on your map. Egypt's in Africa. So Egypt is separated from Palestine or Israel by the Sinai. And there was a UN force in Sinai to kind of keep the peace. The president of Egypt, his name was Nasser, he kicked out the UN force, and he declared, Nasser, a blockade of Israeli ports, that he would fire on any ships that tried to deliver anything to Israel. According to international law, that's an act of war, declaring a blockade on another country. So Israel felt that it was attacked in that way. Jordan actually attacked, and Syria actually attacked. And Israel fought them off, beat all 3 countries in 6 days, and captured territory. I will just have to tell you, without knowing what that would lead to, Israel captured from Egypt the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Hardly anybody lived in the Sinai, some Bedouin wandering Arabs. Not many people lived in that desert that was in between where the UN forces used to be. Sinai, not many people. But helpful as a buffer of land to separate, if you're Israel, to separate you from hostile Egypt. So Israel captured the Sinai. Gaza, well, that was a matter of more than 500,000 hungry and poor Palestinian Arab refugees who largely had lost their homes in that first war in 1948. So they were living in this Gaza Strip area that the Egyptian government had never given much of anything to. And the UN was giving some refugee aid and some money. Schools run by a UN agency. Organizations there would just basically organize all sorts of guerrilla and even terrorist groups. Gaza was really bad. But when Israel captured it, I'm not going to say it got much better. Gaza's just been bad and crowded and poor. But Israel had it after that 6-day war, June of 1967. From Jordan, Israel captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The holy city of Jerusalem, so important in our literature and in our reality, and of course in our Bible studies. Jerusalem was divided. There was a newer city that mostly had been built by Israeli Jews, and so Israel had that from 48 to 67. And the older part of Jerusalem, the historic parts, including the church that was built at the place where it's believed Christ was crucified, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the church at Gethsemane, the garden where he was betrayed by Judas, those were in the Arab East Jerusalem, run by Jordan. And the truth is that that King Hussein of Jordan, who most of us, if we remember him, think of as a pretty good guy, friendly with the United States, later revealed, in fact, to be on the CIA payroll. Yes, King Hussein of Jordan. But when it came to Jerusalem, he didn't keep it in good shape at all. He didn't allow Jewish tourists to come to the site of what had been the Jewish Holy Temple, where there's a wall known as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. King Hussein wouldn't allow Jews to come. No. It was all done in a very sort of hostile way, not developed, still left poor, junky, messy Jerusalem. Well, as a result of the Six-Day War in 67, Israel now had the entire city of Jerusalem and the whole surrounding area all the way to the River Jordan, the West Bank. But that meant that Israel now was administering or ruling over more Arab Palestinians. So some in Gaza who were poor and crowded. In the West Bank, generally there was more farmland, there were people with decent houses. It was better economically. It wasn't that tough for the Israelis. They became the new administrators in the West Bank, and there weren't that many complaints. And Israel officially said, we are willing to negotiate. We are willing to negotiate some futures. We beat you. Israel said, we beat you all in the Six-Day War. We're willing to negotiate. And the Arab countries had a big summit. It happened to be in Khartoum, Sudan, the country just south of Egypt. That's where the Arab leaders all got together and they all agreed unanimously on the 3 no's, which included no recognition of Israel, no negotiation, no recognition of Israel, no agreement that any Palestinian land should go to the Jews. So he said, all right, fine, we'll keep the land. But in addition, Israeli governments, whether they were right-wing or left-wing, whatever their politics were after various elections, kept approving Jewish settlements. That some of those Israeli Jews who actually wanted to live in the West Bank because of the biblical connections, where Jews had lived in the past, because the air was nicer, because there was more open space where you could build a bigger house or a community, etc. Jews got permission to build towns, settlements as they're called, in the West Bank. Now, for some years that wasn't a problem, but as there were more and more and more of them, the Palestinian Arabs started complaining that they're being boxed out totally. They're taking away our water resources. They're taking the best roads and the highland for themselves. For many years, Israel said, this is temporary. If you would just come and negotiate. Now, I'm sorry to tell you that many people feel it's too late to negotiate, at least over all of it. A lot of the settlements are a fact. Now, some of you actually, if you ever examined it, may think, that's okay. That's fair enough. Jews returned to where they'd been back in the days of the Bible. In fact, as recently as, say, 1929 and 1936, Jews were living in parts of the West Bank. Don't forget, it was then British-ruled Palestine. The Brits ruled it. So Arabs lived in some places and Jews lived in some places. And there were Jews who lived in what is now considered the West Bank, and they were massacred by Arab terrorists. No question about it. Jewish communities were massacred by Arab attackers. The British police, rushed over to the scene and said, oh, sorry, lots of dead Jews, oh well. There was a lot of violence back and forth, but 2 notable massacres of Jews. And so after 1967, and especially after the Arabs said we're not going to negotiate, naturally, not surprisingly, Jewish communities said, oh, we're going to move back to those places. Again, as a sort of a measure of defiance. Well, now these things are all so controversial that some people think it's an obstacle to even possibly having peace talks. There are others who say, well, then the sooner the better you have peace talks. Deals have been offered to Palestinian leaders, especially in the last 20 years. Why do I mention 20 years? 1993 was an amazing breakthrough year in which Israel negotiated with the PLO. The PLO was Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat had sent his men to murder Jews in various places in Europe and in Israel, to hijack airplanes and blow them up. He was a terrorist chief. Arafat would say later, and I had the experience, I almost said the honor, the experience of interviewing him for CBS. He was at a particular meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where he was arguing some point before a United Nations body. And so CBS, had me interview him. I'd already written a book, in fact, about the secret cooperation between the Jordanians and the Israelis in a period of time in which King Hussein and the Israelis kind of wanted to outfox the PLO. And so I think the Palestinians around Arafat knew me as kind of someone, he knows a lot about us. Why is CBS sending him? They must have thought it was all conspiratorial and weird. It was kind of a weird interview, I'll give you that. And he was a man of slogans more than anything. But you knew you were interviewing one of the most notorious terrorists who had rebranded himself as a so-called diplomat. Well, 20 years ago, even the Israeli government accepted him as such. There were many meetings and handshakes with cameras and everything of Israeli prime ministers and Yasser Arafat. I can't stress this enough to those of you who are young. He was like a famous terrorist name. And yet there was the Israeli prime minister meeting him. The first very public picture of that sort was 20 years ago on the White House lawn. A president you know very well in Arkansas named Bill Clinton had worked really hard on promoting the idea of Israeli-Arab peace, and he was delighted to host the signing of a framework accord. Not quite a peace treaty, but a set of understandings, including mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And on the White House lawn outdoors in a huge ceremony in which Arabs and Jews and people who had prayed for years that somehow these warring parties could sit together somewhere, there they were, shaking hands on the White House lawn, signing that deal for mutual recognition, and therefore scheduling serious talks. Now, Bill Clinton was the man right there, and he tried very hard to carry that ball toward the goal line, but he actually failed. By Clinton's own description, Yasser Arafat walked away from a deal. In the years that followed, there was a deal. The Israelis would have given him most of the West Bank and all of Gaza. Kind of tricky, a two-part country, Gaza, the West Bank, with Israel in between. But there were plans for all sorts of things like special bridges connecting them, rail lines that would be secure. That's where the Palestinian Arabs lived, in the Gaza and the West Bank. So they planned on making it a two-part country. And Arafat heard the details of this and said, no, if they don't give me 100% of all the land that Jordan used to hold, of all the West Bank, I don't want this deal at all, and I need East Jerusalem too. And so no deal. Bill Clinton was very disappointed in the end, and you know what? That was the year 2000. Bill Clinton's last months in office were late 2000. That's 12 1/3 years ago. It's been nothing but disappointment since then. So I'm reviewing again. What did Israel capture as we mix in the history here? So from Egypt, the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. From Jordan, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And from Syria, the Israelis captured the Golan Heights. So that's a part of Syria, not far from Syria's capital, Damascus. Now, the Syrians were always a very difficult enemy. They refused to accept Israel in any way at all. Just nasty. You've heard of President Assad, who's in power now. There's a civil war in Syria for the last couple of years. Terrible. Clearly, more than 70,000 people, most of them civilians, have been killed. 70,000 in the civil war in Syria. These rebels are trying to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad. Well, Bashar had a father who was the dictator for decades, Hafez al-Assad. And the Israelis captured the Golan Heights, and in the years that followed, they offered negotiations, they had some secret talks, that if Syria would give up the struggle and accept Israel and open the border to friendly traffic and to transportation and trade, then he could have the Golan Heights back. And then they ended up arguing at a certain stage, you mean every bit of it? Or the last 100 yards is yours, mine? Then they would argue about maps that had been drawn by British and French experts back in 1924. The effort broke down. The truth is, and I know from the Israeli side very well, they didn't trust the guy anyway. Yeah, he would sign a piece of paper maybe to get back the Golan Heights, but we don't trust Assad. He's a horrible, bloodthirsty dictator. I'm not that comfortable making a deal with him. You know what, maybe we'll keep the Golan Heights. Maybe in the future, well, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, annexed the Golan Heights and made a declaration to the effect, we're keeping them. We need it for security. We're being fair to the very few people who live up there. Some of them agree, there aren't many. Syria, of course, desperately wants it back, but in the civil war, there's no point right now. Now, what has happened in the Golan Heights Israeli troops still drive their jeeps back and forth patrolling on the ceasefire line from June of 1967. And then there was a further stage of war, I told you, in the Yom Kippur War. So the ceasefire line that was negotiated through intermediaries in early 1974, Israel still patrols that, and someone's been shooting at them. Several times in the last month, someone's been shooting at the Israelis. Now, I think Israeli intelligence does have it figured out. Is it the Syrian official army? Is it some of these rebels? What is it? The Syrian army has never dared to shoot at us because they know we could just, drop artillery shells on President Assad's home, which the Israelis could do. So for various reasons, they figure it's the rebels, which underlines the following about the Syrian situation. We don't know who we want to win. And when I say we, I mean the United States in addition to Israel. They actually stand together on this. The U.S. and Israel are exchanging intelligence about Syria all the time. It was in the news today that our Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel confirmed that Syria's army, the government's army, used chemical weapons against their own people. Used some sort of poison gas, mustard gas, skin-burning chemicals. Truth is, the United States didn't want to specify, didn't want to say how much intelligence they have and not. The concern about that, I'll be very blunt with you. It's not the U.S. and Israel's concern that some Syrian civilians or rebels are burned or unfairly being wiped out by horrible weapons. No, the concern is that the horrible weapons are there, that the Syrian government has them, that they're out there being deployed, they're with military units, they could be grabbed by terrorist groups. Syria is known to support the Hezbollah extremist group in Lebanon. Shiite Muslims financed by Iran, for many years armed by Syria, often taking orders from Iran and Syria. That's Hezbollah in Lebanon. A lot of terrorists. They hijacked American aircraft to Beirut in the mid-'80s. They blew up the U.S. embassy in Beirut. They blew up the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and also a Jewish community center, showing that they are basically anti-Semitic. If they were targeting Israel's army or even an Israeli embassy in far-off Buenos Aires, Argentina, that's one thing. Why did Hezbollah blow up a Jewish community center? Because in their mind, it's all the same. Jewish people are the enemy. We have to wipe out the Jews. That's the kind of mentality terrorists from that region have. Syria's been in league with them. The fear is that if Syria's chemical weapons are on the loose and on the move, Hezbollah might get them. Other terrorist groups might get them. And now, after President Obama said that the use of chemical weapons by Syria would be a game changer, crossing a red line set by the United States in public, what do? Good sources tell me that U.S. military commandos, yes, the Navy SEAL Team 6 type people, are on standby and they know where Syria stores its chemical weapons, and one of these nights, one of these days, American commandos, maybe with Israel taking part, maybe not, might stage lightning raids on these arsenals inside Syria in order to take those weapons, go in there, take them, fly them out by helicopter. What is considered that important? That terrorists not get that weapon. Now, let's raise that issue to a much higher level, Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. and Israel both have said in public they will not let Iran develop a nuclear weapon. Iran barely hides the fact that they're enriching uranium, that they have centrifuges, hundreds of them, machines that spin uranium in order to enrich it, that makes it more powerful, and when it gets to a certain degree, it even could be the fuel or the power in a nuclear bomb. You also have to design a bomb, you generally have to test it, you have to be an expert in the metal work that's required, the triggering mechanism, there are many other things. But if you don't know, Iran is a smart country with many, many trained physicists, scientists, etc. And so Iran seems to have a very strong and advanced nuclear program where they deny they're making a nuclear bomb, but Israel, the US, and let me go on, Britain, France, Germany, do not believe the Iranian denials. All those countries are highly concerned. You may have heard of the negotiations that continue sporadically. The P5+1 negotiate with Iran. One side of the table, Iran, saying, well, we're not making nuclear bombs. What do you want? We're only using uranium for peaceful purposes, like generating electricity, and we need medical isotopes. That's Iran's claim. Who's the P5 plus 1? The permanent 5 plus 1. Let me fill in. Americans don't much hear about the permanent 5. These are the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. They're considered the 5 big powers in the world. I think I can get them all: Russia, China, Britain, France, and the US. Those 5 countries, plus 1, plus Germany. Germany is such an important country in recent years, an economic power, and they are very concerned about stability in the Middle East too, in part because of the flow of oil, etc. The P5 plus 1, those countries, remember the US is one of them. They want to have a peaceful resolution to this standoff with Iran. Meanwhile, Israel, with its small size, but its very potent Air Force, which has managed to do all sorts of surprise attacks in surprising corners of the Middle East. Israel destroyed Iraq's nuclear reactor without asking anyone's permission in 1981. The Israeli Air Force destroyed a Syrian nuclear reactor in an obscure corner of Syria where North Korean scientists, you believe this, were helping Syria work on a possible nuclear weapons program, and so a nuclear reactor was being built, and Israel's government, we have in our book, we managed to get kind of a moment-by-moment outline of what happened in the drama. Israel's government turned to President George W. Bush and said, here's the evidence, here are the photos, here's what our spies were able to get in Syria. You see, it's a nuclear reactor of the North Korean type. President Bush, we'd like you to destroy it. You've got the best missiles, you could just take it out. And George W. Bush and his team met about it, and if you know anything about former Vice President Dick Cheney said, good idea, great idea, the U.S. should show its muscle in the Middle East, we should do that. Bush apparently felt, you know, we've already got a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq, let's not do that. Let's go to the UN and expose and show the intelligence and make the Syrians dismantle their building. And Prime Minister Ehud Olmert of Israel, visiting Washington, said, George, I'm a little disappointed. And he went home, and within a few weeks, the Israeli Air Force had just worked out how they would do it, and they erased the building, they destroyed it. Well, if necessary, the Israelis say they would attack targets in Iran. It's not as easy, there's not just one site. There's a lot of facilities in Iran. It's very far away from Israel. It would be difficult. But the Israelis want it to be known that they're serious. They're not going to let Iran proceed toward a nuclear bomb or even having enough enriched uranium that they could quickly make a bomb. And so the Israelis are constantly putting out warnings. Obama's reaction, including in his trip to Israel just a few weeks ago, I've got your back. And I'm not ridiculing it at all. It's a big statement. President Obama says, I'm not going to let Iran get a nuclear bomb, but because the nature of US weaponry, we don't have to hit them this year. There's still time for diplomacy. We still have strong economic sanctions. This is the Obama position, and most of the other P5 plus 1 nations agree. Let's still negotiate, put pressure. The sanctions are hurting Iran's economy. Maybe Iran will scale down its nuclear program, export some of its nuclear fuel, agree to freeze it. We don't want a war in the Middle East. Obama is telling Israel, don't attack Iran. Certainly don't do it by surprise. You've taken us by surprise before. We understand. And Obama practically said, we like you. We recognize Israel. We recognize your right to defend yourself. But please don't do it. It would be very, very disruptive. So the Israelis are still warning every day. Obama's still trying sanctions and diplomacy with the belief that there is more time. But that's I think, the big crisis. In the Q&A, the questions and answers, you may ask me about other things, as I said, my career, broadcasting, chance of peace with the Palestinians, all sorts of things. I got it. But I want to tell you, if you remember something from my speech here tonight, that I'm sorry to say that with all that history and all those interlocking pieces, we even mentioned North Korea tonight. Wow. And we didn't even get to the Arab Spring and the big volatile changes. We mentioned Syria and its civil war. But Egypt has changed. Jordan's current king is always in danger. What's happening with other countries in the Arab world that might change? It's a volatile time, but it's all trumped by Iran and its nuclear program, because that could lead to a very wide war. Iran is not an Arab country, it's an Islamic country. Most of the Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia, hate Iran. It's Sunni Muslim type of faith, that's Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries mainly. And the other side, Iran, Shiite Muslim. So I think that, frankly, Saudi Arabia would like somebody to hit Iran hard, but they can't say it in public. But that's really the biggest issue. And that's what you should be on the lookout for and understand better. Iran became a radical Islamic state only in 1979. Later that year, they took American diplomats hostage in the embassy. For those of you who are movie fans and saw Argo, that was real. And some Americans were able to sneak out thanks to the story in the Ben Affleck movie Argo. But in reality, 52 Americans were held hostage, and we were humiliated for 444 days till Iran released them in January of 1981, the very day that Ronald Reagan was sworn in. So Iran has been a difficult country. I can understand some people who say, let them have their system. They want to be an Islamic republic, yeah. Well, what, not if they're exporting terrorism. Not if they're publicly saying that Israel should be wiped off the map. And not if they're building nuclear weapons that I think would be a danger to the region, maybe the world. Okay, time for your questions. It's great to be here. Thank you very much. Can I ask for a bottle of water or a glass if that's all that's available? Any volunteer? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kirsch.
Again, thank you, everyone. And I think Dan just performed well. I did.
It's all right.
Great.
But any questions, like I said, they could be career, regional, anything you like.
Pass this around.
I have two questions for you. One, how do you see the Iranian nuclear situation being resolved? And two, why did Obama cover up on what happened in Libya?
Okay, two very different situations, of course. So what is perhaps likely, okay, lemonade, wow. What is likely to happen with Iran as it so far refuses to scale down its nuclear program? I think the Iranian economy is being very hard hit. No Iranian company can actually use dollars, foreign currency. No bank transfers are being allowed at all. The international banking system cut off Iran. And so, a country and its corporations need to buy things, farm equipment, usually food, things like that. Iran, in fact, has to buy refined gasoline. They don't have a big refinery. They make crude oil, but they have to bring in refined gasoline. Some countries might start cutting off shipments of that. I'm saying that Iran may be hurt enough that they will decide, you know what, it's not worth it to have this enriched uranium program. It's not worth it. Let's call it off. Let's scale it down. Let's make it verifiable. They might make that decision, believing that Israel might attack. That doesn't seem to scare them. I don't think it's the Shiite Muslim suicidal tendency that some people say. I don't think it's that. You really have serious people practicing statecraft in Iran, but an unusual state. One dominated by one Islamic party, where the dictator really is one senior Ayatollah. His name is Khamenei. It's not Khomeini who founded the Islamic Republic. He's dead. It's a new fellow, Ali Khamenei, and he sits in the holy city of Qom, and he really pulls all the strings. He's more important than the obnoxious President Ahmadinejad. So there's a dictator there, but he needs his country to be a success and be prosperous and feed everybody, so that the mosques and the schools can continue, etc. Even Khamenei may back off. So there is that possibility. But knowing the Israelis as I do, there's the real possibility that not quite now. They're still willing to give the process a little more time. And after Obama's trip to Israel, that really made the Israelis feel better about Obama. They had their doubts. There was a lot of friction between Obama and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu for about 3 years. But now that Obama has visited Israel and said all the right things from an Israeli point of view, they actually do trust him more. And they're willing to give him more time on this. But late this year, next year, if the Iranians haven't stopped their enrichment, meaning their creation of even more enriched uranium, which could power a bomb, I don't think the Israelis would take it. I think that any Israeli prime minister would feel it's his historic responsibility to make sure there's never a Holocaust again and protect Israel. So I think there's also an even chance that Israel will take action, cause a lot of damage to Iran's facilities, probably not eliminate everything, but slow down the Iranians, and, well, who knows what are we going to have then? Wider bloodshed, more terrorism financed by Iran, or Iran will back off. You don't know. I asked a fellow when he was, a friend of mine who was very senior in Israeli military intelligence, what is your official assessment? How would Iran react to being bombed by Israel? And this Israeli said to me, that is the $64 million question. They don't know. They just don't know. They don't really kind of want to do it because it's risky, but they may feel there's no choice. They will not let Iran get a nuclear bomb.
What else?
There's a roving microphone, thanks to Ellen.
How much better would it be if the United States did so instead? How preferable would that be in the region outside Israel?
Wow. For the U.S. to attack Iran rather than Israel to attack Iran. First, military logistics. The U.S. could do a far more potent and effective job. They can leave a lot more uranium facilities in Iran smoldering with smoke. Israel has a small air force, a small missile force, couldn't do as much. So in other words, if you've come around to the belief that someone needs to, I'll use a biblical word, someone needs to smite Iran's nuclear program, you may say, well, better it be the U.S., at least it'll be effective. But as Americans, do we want to be blamed by the region? Right, that raid is almost for sure going to kill Muslims. And so other Muslims in other Muslim countries, even if they don't like Iran, will be inflamed that America has again killed Muslims. It could even lead to more misguided jerks who are in this country or thinking of moving to this country to be self-appointed terrorists and place bombs in various places, thinking they're doing that to fight back on behalf of Islam. As I say, if the U.S. is directly involved with things like that in the Middle East, it could hurt us. If Israel does it politically, that's better for the U.S. Yes, many experts say, oh, the U.S. will be blamed anyway. It's assumed in the Middle East that the U.S., Israel are all the same. Yeah, it's not the same as the United States Air Force and Missile Force doing such a thing. If Israel does it, it's more convenient. So it has been suggested by people I trust that if it got to the point that U.S. and Israel both felt a secret decision that Iran should be smitten, no, that's not the right word, that Israel should, that Iran should be hit, that even the U.S., that even U.S. and Israel together should have Israel do it, with great U.S. support, etc. Better to have your proxy in the region do it. I owe the gentleman just a quick response to his question about why is Obama covering up what happened in Benghazi, Libya. First, it's terrible. It hurts me. It pains me. I know a lot of people who know this very charming Ambassador Chris Stevens and the other 3 Americans who were killed in Benghazi. In a night of horrible confusion, terrible security, I'm going to say something that's not quite polite to say. A lot of this is Ambassador Chris Stevens' fault. I'm just telling you the insight here. There was no bigger expert on Libya post-Gaddafi. After Colonel Gaddafi, the dictator, was deposed, the U.S. and NATO countries helped the rebels in many ways. So Gaddafi was on the run, he was killed, gotcha. We're trying to have a good relationship with the new, hopefully pro-democracy Libya. So we have Ambassador Chris Stevens, who speaks Arabic, and he knows the local culture, and he's making friends and all that. And the capital of Libya is Tripoli. That's where there's a U.S. embassy, Tripoli. As well as the center of the oil industry offices, a huge construction project that American companies got the contract for, to build a ring road around Tripoli, etc. Tripoli is really where it's happening. Benghazi is like a different society, very, very far away off to the east, toward Egypt. And Chris Stevens said, oh, I know the people in Benghazi too. That's where the revolt against Gaddafi started. Great, I'm going to go there. I'm going to take a trip there. No one even pointed out that it's 9/11 on the calendar, so terrorists might want to strike at American security for Mr. Stevens. Our ambassador, very low. All the warnings in this, that came through, all the memos that were sent and addressed to Hillary Clinton in Washington, no one was really paying attention. There wasn't enough budget to send more guards. You can't sit there on the guy. But what is he doing in a barely protected house that is our consulate in Benghazi, Libya? Sorry, he's the on-the-spot expert. He shouldn't have been there. It's really terrible. Now, after the fact, Where for some reason the Obama White House didn't want to call it terrorism, but say, well, there was a demonstration just like the one in Cairo on the same night. Shows you how these things are all interlinked. A demonstration by angry Arabs against that really rude, obnoxious video film that an anti-Islamic guy in California made. He happens to be Coptic Egyptian Christian by background, the fellow in California, who made this really rude, insulting, terrible movie featuring the Prophet Muhammad back in the day, mistreating women and doing horrible things. It's just an obnoxious film. And when it was put on the internet, you know what the world is like these days. Put it on YouTube, people will see it. And they will protest outside the U.S. Embassy. So it's no lie. An angry mob was in Cairo outside the U.S. Embassy, besieging it and making American diplomats in Cairo feel very much in danger. The same night, that's when the attack happens that kills 4 Americans in Benghazi, Libya. Well, it turns out later we learned there was no peaceful protest. There were no signs. There's no sign anyone went over there because of the obnoxious video on YouTube. Apparently terrorists had planned, and probably more likely because it was 9/11, to attack the lightly protected U.S. ambassador and kill him, which they did. So I think the Obama administration I think they were embarrassed. They didn't get it wrong. They didn't read correctly what was going on. They didn't know what the danger was of the YouTube video and how to handle it. Condemning a YouTube video, and then many Republicans in Congress said, you can't condemn any American filmmaker. We have freedom of speech and freedom of the press in America. He may have made an obnoxious video, but you can't condemn it. I disagree. You can't stop him legally from making an obnoxious video, because we have freedom of the press, etc. But you can condemn it. You can, from the White House and the State Department, say that it's a disgusting YouTube video, and we don't agree with it as the U.S. government, and give the guy a whole raft of parking tickets or something in order to harass him, which actually they ended up doing in California. Came up with some other charges against him, which I forgot by now. Was it immigration or illegally filming on a dark street in Santa Monica? Whatever, they did harass him, so they could then say to the Arab world, see, we hate this guy. But they misplayed everything that week. And then they were shocked that 4 Americans had died, including an ambassador. And then the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, goes on 5 TV news talk shows on the following Sunday and avoids the word terrorism like the plague. And says, well, you know, it was a demonstration that got out of hand. Not good, not well handled. I don't think there was a supreme goal. I don't think that the Obama administration thinks it's important to deny there's terrorism, but I will say this. When the bombs went off in Boston, and there was a hint that the Obama White House was not calling it terrorism right away, from that day, 3 dead people, including an 8-year-old child in Boston. 200 people plus injured, people having lost limbs. And he didn't call it terrorism? Might be a crime, might just be 2 jerks who for no reason put bombs on Boylston Street in Boston. There was an outcry which reached the White House pretty quickly, and by late in that day in writing they said terrorism. And the next day, I'll tell you, as a broadcaster on CBS Radio, why is Obama coming to the White House briefing room to give us the latest on Boston? There was nothing. The guys hadn't been found yet. It was the Tuesday. It was the day after the crime. Obama wanted to call it terrorism. It sort of does have political import. And Obama learned that we sort of want our attention drawn to something that major. I think our government used to think that if they say terrorism, we'll be scared, we'll stop going to shopping malls, our economy will dry up, the stock market will go down 1,000,000 points. So they were afraid of using that word, but I think now they've learned there's a call to use it. We should realize that we're at war against terrorists who hate us, and even the Obama administration is there with that feeling now. I'm happy to continue if you are a student, please. Female first. If you are a student.
Yeah. Oh, here you go.
Here comes the microphone.
I know that there's a very strong Hamas presence in the Gaza Strip, and I know that the West Bank is very unorganized because they're still kind of ruled by the PLO and Hamas doesn't really have a footing. But if somehow they could get into the West Bank and therefore have a united front, Hamas, do you think that they could be a Palestinian danger?
Great and specific question, so I'll fill in for anyone left behind in the dust by that. In 2005, 8 years ago, the Israelis got out of Gaza. They had occupied Gaza. from the Six-Day War in 67 till 2005, 38 years. And the Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, who was thought of as a really tough guy who would never give up anything, said, you know, let's try an experiment. We'll close down all the Jewish settlements. We'll pull out the Israeli army. We'll let the Palestinians have Gaza. Now, a cynical Israeli said at the time, oh, you're going to let them fight it out? The different factions of Palestinian Arabs? The PLO or Al-Fatah group of Yasser Arafat, which by then was thought of as more moderate and relatively good guys. And the Hamas organization, which absolutely was sending suicide bombers to blow up buses and restaurants and killing civilians, and also said politically they will never accept a Jewish state of Israel. Hamas is committed to wiping out the Jewish state of Israel. But Hamas also was much more religious, and therefore had a kind of respect, you know, among your average Palestinian who said, ooh, Hamas is clean. They don't take bribes. They're praying all the time. I respect them, I do. Whereas the Yasser Arafat group, Al-Fatah, they've been taking bribery for years. They are corrupt. I've had it with them. They never got us an independent country. I've had it with them. So Gaza embraced Hamas. Gaza became radical. Yes, there was even an election, but there was also a brief civil war in which Palestinians were killing each other, and Hamas, the radicals, won. This was truly a setback for the U.S. Only if you're a cynic you would say, the Palestinian radicals have shown their true colors. They have Gaza, you can never negotiate with them. There's nothing useful about that. I wish somehow that the United States and its partners like Britain, France, and Germany had helped the good guys have a moderate Gaza Strip as a model of economic development and education, but no, Gaza's terrible. So the Israelis built a security wall around Gaza. They absolutely check every truckload or shipload of anything coming in to allow no weapons, explosives, and rockets, because Hamas regularly has been firing rockets over the wall at Israeli towns and villages. We had a mini war just about 5 months ago over just that. As the Israelis say, you think you got rockets? We're going to blast you. A lot of deaths, but that stopped. That stopped Hamas for a while. That was a few months ago. Okay, so if Hamas makes advances politically in the West Bank, which is relatively prosperous, where the education system works better, but Palestinians don't have full freedom. They don't have the pride of their own country. Many Palestinians are still angry at the Al-Fatah movement for getting them nothing. A very nice guy from a U.S. point of view, named Salam Al-Fayed, 1 week ago resigned as Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. The president is Mahmoud Abbas. He's the successor to Yasser Arafat. He's kind of an old terrorist who was reformed. He went to the UN last year and won the famous UN vote that got the Palestinians a little more recognition at the UN in New York. And the Americans said, what'd you do that for? You're just stirring the pot. You are such a pain in the... So the US was happy to work instead with Prime Minister Fayyad, American educated economist, good guy. Fayyad quit last week. He said, I can't accomplish anything. Forget it. Thanks a lot. Walked away. There is no moderate. There's no moderate you can work with now in the Palestinian movement in the West Bank. And this President Mahmoud Abbas is close to retiring and giving up. There's a very good chance that Hamas, religious, uncorruptible, determined to win, might take over the West Bank. And Israel says, we're not going to accept that. We can't suddenly have rockets raining down on Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other cities from the east, from the West Bank, as well as from Gaza. So what are you going to have? Another mini war with tanks rolling in and aerial strikes and all that? Yeah, you could. It could be very dangerous indeed. The optimist, that's me, remember? The optimist says Hamas may change. Hamas may be convinced, bought out, bribed, see the reality that they'll get more. They'll get more food. They'll get more power. They will be able to actually run the West Bank and Gaza. They will have achieved their internal victory over their rivals, Al-Fatah. Hamas could be convinced in secret talks, and you know who the intermediary would be? It would be the president of Egypt. He's their friend, that Islamic Brotherhood guy, Mohammed Morsi. He was very effective. He helped Hillary Clinton end that mini war in Gaza about 5 months ago. Morsi gets $2 billion a year in U.S. aid and desperately needs it. He may be an Islamic Brotherhood kind of guy. He may be Hamas's friend ideologically, but he needs the U.S. money, could cooperate with the U.S. You can sort of work something out secretly with Hamas. No more violence, no more attacks. No suicide bombs. You can wave your green flag around all you want, but you better negotiate one day. You better accept at least a ceasefire with Israel. Some Hamas leaders, by the way, have said, we will never accept a Jewish state of Israel. We will never sign a peace treaty, but we could consider a long ceasefire, known in Arabic as a hudna, a temporary truce. Critics of Muslim culture say, oh yes, there are many cases in which the Prophet Muhammad himself signed a tactical hudna, but then a short while afterward went right back to war. Fine. You know, we're not living in the 6th century anymore. There's so many ways now to control these situations, to deter them, to scare them, to bribe them, to give them fuel or cut off fuel, to give them electricity or cut off electricity in Gaza and the West Bank. The optimist in me says, Hamas may well win, and that's bad. They're terrible killers, but at least they're incorruptible. And maybe if they control things, you actually can have a ceasefire in which lives are saved. That's the optimist in me. I'm here as long as you want. I'm happy to be. I'm a student. Okay. I love talking the Middle East.
So I'm in the process of formulating a question for my senior thesis.
Hold the mic closer.
And I'm interested in hearing your perspective on this issue, given your career. Perhaps you can offer a comparative perspective between the U.S. and Israel on this question that I'd like to ask for my senior thesis. It is, what impact does public opinion, political discourse, have on foreign policy? It's a pretty complex issue, but...
Oh, sure. Public opinion and discourse and the media, what effect does that have on foreign policy? Let's take 2 case studies. A country we know very well, the United States, and a small country we've been discussing this evening. That's Israel. 50-1. That's not the odds of something. That's the size comparison. The U.S. has 350 million people. Israel has 7. And the latest figures are actually 380 million here, 7.6 in Israel. But about 350 million. So it's a different situation. So Israel feels its back is against the wall. So think about this when it comes to foreign policy and defense. I've written a book about Israeli intelligence. I've written 2 books, in fact, with an Israeli co-author journalist. So Israel is the kind of country that has an immensely busy and active military and secret spy agency, the Mossad, feeling they have to. They've got enemies all around them, there's no choice. They've had a lot more terrorism inside their borders than we have. And the Israeli people are okay with it. They don't ask too many questions. There has never been a hearing in the Israeli parliament on the assassination policy, even though Israel's Mossad agency has assassinated terrorists. Now, we reveal in our book sort of the system. The prime minister has to approve every assassination mission. And that's your political responsibility. But it's not in public. It's not discussed, etc. That wouldn't happen here. So I start with that basis, if you have to compare the 2. Israel has a tradition of feeling itself back against the wall, challenged, in danger. Therefore, the public is willing to accept adventurism, controversial things, violations of international law, feeling we've got to do this. It's a hard life, it's a difficult region, etc. Still, if there is something in Israel that does get the public's attention, then the newspapers will be full of it, not questioning things like how they fight the PLO in general, or terrorists, but other things, including in foreign affairs. You know, was it a mistake to make some agreement with Vladimir Putin of Russia? Or is it a mistake now to plan, as Israel explores natural gas in the Mediterranean? A very large quantity is being tapped into now. There are offshore wells that Israel has with an American company called Noble Energy working with Israel. They found it. They found more than enough energy for Israel and neighbors. Now it's natural gas, requires some conversions of industry, etc. A lot of it can be exported. A decision's been made to work with Turkey to export it toward Europe. Turkey, wait. Israel and Turkey have been on the outs lately for years now. The Turkish prime minister has turned into an obnoxious guy who's just saying horrible things about Israel all the time. Unfortunately, they had the incident of a Turkish ship of protesters approaching Gaza. Israeli commandos landed on the ship. 9 Turkish men were killed. Turkey said, the Zionists must apologize. And Israel refused for years until Obama was there last month and got the 2 leaders on the phone together and kind of made Netanyahu apologize. Okay, and we'll pay compensation to the 9 families. And Turkey said, okay, then we'll send ambassadors back to Tel Aviv. Okay. It's so strategically important including for the US. Turkey is a NATO alliance ally. Israel's our ally. Iran is the enemy. Syria is burning. Syria is between Turkey and Israel on the map. It's so important to the US that Turkey and Israel get along like two allies, and that's getting better. Again, everything incredibly interlinked. So those subjects come up in the Israeli press, and it has an effect on a prime minister. He needs to get reelected. In this case, in Israel, he had elections in January. He got reelected, formed a new coalition. But those things come up. The U.S., let me talk about foreign affairs and defense policy. You're not interested. No kidding. Thank God you're here this evening. Most people aren't, right? Elections are not won and lost generally on foreign affairs. The first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, now in his late 80s, he beat Iraq in the first Gulf War in 1991, yet was trounced by Bill Clinton in 1992. He said, I won a war. I defeated communism. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union no longer exists. I'm seeking re-election in November 92, and the American public don't care about foreign affairs and defeating Soviet unions and things like that. That's one of your differences to look at. Foreign affairs do not rank high in the election issues and therefore in the pressure campaigns on politicians here, whereas in Israel, foreign and defense affairs, that's life.
In relation to this U.S. position in Iran with the negotiations, how does that previous experience with the CIA and that whole issue, how far does that rank in, and what do you think the U.S. could do to mitigate problems caused by our intervention previously and removal of their democratically elected?
Well, you've probably heard this about Iran. The government hates the United States, but the people of Iran, they like the United States. Now you get down to the base, they like our music, they like our blue jeans, etc., but they like our people. Most people in Iran, especially university students, they would love to get visas all the time to study here at Hendrix and elsewhere. They'd like to be more like America. Most people. Some people are radical hotheads over there who think that the United States and Britain really screwed Iran over the years. So they're very glad they have their proud Islamic nationalistic government. That's some. Nobody takes a fair opinion poll over there. People are terrified to ever vote against the leaders of the party in power, so I can't put numbers on it. Except whenever a U.S. or a British journalist goes there and talks to people in private, again, we usually end up talking with academics, journalists, students. They sound like, we'd love to be friends, we're thinking like you. So they yearn for a deal, a fair deal, the open up negotiations, maybe again to have diplomatic relations and embassies. It would be great, even if that country is different. We had diplomatic relations with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and with all the communist countries for years. You know, we had an embassy in communist China when it was still communist. For many years we didn't, but then we did. So things do change, and I think dialogue would be a good thing, and there's a real possibility of openings with Iran, which I think, the optimist in me says, that would generally moderate Iran's behavior. Maybe you know it in Arkansas better than I do, you catch more bees with honey. So generally offering people positive things, more involvement in the world trade system, smoother relations, more respect, I think generally that will tamp down terrorism and support for terroristic groups. So I hope that we will make a turn toward negotiations. But I got to be fair to you. Obama has said this. He said, it's up to the Iranians. We've got the P5+1 talks, and if there could be a nuclear deal, we look forward to a day in which we are communicating with Iran, its people, and its government. So I think we're offering it. I think it's really up to Iran, and whether a government that is proudly revolutionary can really moderate its behavior and get along with us. I think that's the test right now. Students are great. Students are great.
What do you think is the best case scenario for the situation in Syria, and what do you think is the most likely outcome?
Oh boy, Syria's tragic, horrible. I mean, deaths and there's never been anything like it, by the way, that it's on YouTube and other news sites, social networking sites. that we can see people suffer so, whole neighborhoods destroyed. President Assad's father, destroyed an entire city, which was Hama. Pardon me for forgetting the year, about 1990 as I recall, and there was no coverage. Just nobody could get pictures of it, etc. Now it does. People have cell phones and they have the internet and they get it out. We're seeing it. It's so disturbing. So on the human level, I wanted to stop. What's the best outcome? That it stop. That there be negotiations between the rebel command and the Bashar Assad government. And they negotiate something. Now I think the violence, the hatred, the anger have gotten to a level that's probably too late for that. But I would hope that it stop. Now, on a political level, it sure looks like it would be a win for the US and Israel if Assad falls. He's been Iran's ally in a strategic place for many years. So Iran would lose a key ally. And it would hurt the terrorist groups that were helped by Assad and his father over the years. So it would be a win if Assad falls. And the civil war will probably lead to him falling. It's really amazing that he has survived in all this violence for more than 2 years. I don't know how much longer he'll survive. He probably will fall. Here's the bad part. That during the Civil War, the rebels became far more unpredictable and piecemeal, broken up, fractious. Some of them are Islamic radicals who hate America and hate the West. Some of them are Al-Qaeda in Iraq men and bombers and fighters who crossed over to Syria to fight there, and waving their Islamic flags, etc. Some of them, however, are dressed like I am tonight, in business suits and ties, and go to Paris and Lisbon and places like that for wonderful little conferences where they talk about the Syrian democracy that they are setting up and a government in exile they are going to declare that they hope the US will recognize. Now the US this month announced that it's going to give another $100 million to the good rebels, not the bad rebels. Now, I'm not telling you the names of the groups exactly because first they change all the time, etc. But it's been a headache for the US government, really pushed by the Europeans. US, please, take the lead. Some critics say Obama is failing to lead here. Syria, stop people from dying. Decide who your allies are and help them. Help them beat Assad. Well, the US is finding that the rebel leadership and member groups are changing all the time, and it's hard to know who's the good guy, and so the compromise vote was $100 million. A lot of money, a lot of stuff. Non-lethal aid. Food, bandages, night vision goggles, flak jackets. Kind of interesting, by the way, the flak jackets and the night vision goggles allow a soldier, or a rebel soldier, a rebel fighter, to be out there at night and fight. It helps them do their battle. But never let it be said so far that an American bullet killed anybody there. We're not helping the rebels kill anybody. We're giving them flak jackets, night vision goggles, bandages, etc. Okay, it's sort of half in. Now, if you know anything about the Middle East, it never helps to be half in politically. That may be a moral position. I think it reflects the U.S., Washington, being unable to figure out who are the good guys, so we don't want to be all in. But I gotta tell you, in the image in the Middle East, it's like half in. It's not getting us much more respect. It's not getting us all the influence we want to have in a future government if the good guys do win. There is the possibility the extreme Islamic forces will become the new heads of Israel. Again, a very senior man in Israeli intelligence told me this about a year ago. He said, all in all, they will be killing each other for a long time. Now, the humanitarian side of him said, I hope it's not civilians and 70,000 people involved. But let's say there's a new government in Damascus and there are a few rebel groups in different cities. They're going to be busy. From an Israeli point of view, he says, they're not going to make war on us. They're not going to try to reconquer the Golan Heights. You know, they're just going to be crazy. Better that they just be crazy. We'll put up a big wall. We'll monitor them. They better not shoot at us. The chemical weapons is now a problem, but, you know, again, they dream maybe we'll grab the chemical weapons. It's a problem, but if you know anything about, you know your Middle East history, Syria is not the most important country. They're not an oil exporter. It's just kind of the symbol of what it is. A terrible dictator, overthrown in the Arab Spring movement. It'd be good to get rid of him, of Assad. A friend of Iran. It would be good to get rid of him. But it's become very messy, bloody, and sad. Yes, Yes, please. Are you a student here too? Okay, hold my
Have you seen the, I imagine you have, the Gatekeepers?
Saw that movie.
And what is your take on the end of that movie, where, you know, it's kind of a point of view of where is the wise man at the end of the hall?
Very good, the conclusion. Well, again, I'll have to bring you all up to speed. Great. The Gatekeepers was a documentary nominated for Best Documentary in the Oscars. It didn't win, but it was very noteworthy that it was nominated. The movie's in Hebrew. It's a really good documentary. It's just beautifully shot, and when it talks about some incident in the Arab-Israeli fighting of the last few decades, it's really clear. It's excellent graphics. You know, the map and the photographs are just used great. But it is basically interviews with 6 men, beautifully cut. These 6 men were the heads of one of the agencies that I write about in my book, Shin Bet, the domestic security. Kind of like the FBI, except it took the lead in counterterrorism. So this movie clearly showed that the Israelis, because of necessity, became the best counterterrorism force ever. They could find and monitor, listen in, and when necessary, even drop a bomb or a missile on just about any terrorist group leader. They had them all monitored. This is computerized systems, this is spies on the ground, etc. A lot of that is hinted at, some of it is even said as to what the secrets of success were. It's a lot of electronic monitoring, plus the spies on the ground, who are sometimes Israelis posing as Arabs, and more often are Palestinians who've sold out. Do blackmail, it's a tough business out there. Threats against their family, yeah, by the Israeli Shin Bet. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. And certainly bribery and promises of lots of money in your future. Those are the methods. It's a tough battle out there. You're trying to turn people who are in a Palestinian terrorist group into an agent for Israel. And they succeeded again and again. Israel is better than anybody at knowing their region, knowing the weak points, the vulnerabilities of their target. Not the guy they want to kill, the guy they want to turn. In the espionage business, you want to find a spy or a terrorist or an activist on the other side. If you can, the president of another country, or the people close to him, and turn him by all the methods I just said. Bribery, threats, blackmail. Happened again and again. So this movie showed their talent at it. The end of the movie, all 6 men basically concluded they've been heads of that Shin Bet agency. Why didn't the Prime Minister of our country take the situation we delivered to him? We just killed the #2 man in the PLO, who had been head of all their military operations. Why didn't the Prime Minister immediately pick up the ball and negotiate something, declare a settlement, a resolution to the problem? Why didn't the political side give us peace? We feel like we've been working here for a combined total of about 60 years of secret and counterterrorism work, largely exposed by the Gatekeepers. Very good movie, really. You have to read the subtitles, but it's very good. But they said in the end, why don't we have peace? Why don't we have peace? Why didn't it resolve everything? I think they're missing the point. I've known a lot of men and a few women. I've actually known a few in intelligence. I'm not just saying there are a few. There are a lot of women in intelligence. They haven't been the heads of agencies, so they generally haven't gone public in Israel. But some of them are starting to be talkative too. Well, here's my point. Whether they are male or female, I find that they think in kind of a closed world. In Washington, I've met CIA-type people too. They're great. They're very, very dedicated to their mission. But they think that their mission will solve everything. They're not really aware of the bigger picture. Let me give it to you in its simplest form. Just because Israel's counterterrorism forces, including the agents they turned and all that, managed to kill, let's say, the #2 man of the PLO, do you think that made the PLO friendlier? Or more amenable to a deal? Do you think that opened up a situation right away where someone was going to have a meeting and make the concession? I mean, heck, 20 years ago, they shook hands with Yasser Arafat, and 7 years later, he walked away from a great deal. It's only one part of the puzzle. Winning the battle against terrorists, in some cases killing them. Let's go to the U.S. context. Killing a lot of them using drone strikes. The U.S. is killing a lot of them. Do you think it makes Muslim militants in Pakistan, where most of our drone strikes have been, give up their battle? No, but I think you're probably happy if we kill a lot of bad guys. who had planned to make a training camp where they would send people to Boston, Times Square, and who knows, Little Rock, in order to blow up Americans, but we're keeping them on the run. It's a constant war. Does anyone think that's opening up the possibility of negotiations with Al-Qaeda or the Pakistani Taliban? No. So I think that's the problem. The Gatekeepers is fascinating, but those men don't have the big picture. I understand their feeling, and it's fascinating to hear their feeling. We worked our whole career, we didn't bring our country peace. We blame the politicians. Okay, fascinating. But I don't think it actually tells the whole story.
Anyone else?
We ended with a movie, that was good.
All right. Thank you, guys. And let's give